Good evening. Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Kubi Ackerman. I am the director of the Future City Lab here at the museum, and I'm very excited to have you here at the fourth event in our public program series, New York's Future at a Changing Climate, which explores the challenges and opportunities presented in the Future City Lab, which is on the first floor of the museum and is part of our New York at its Core exhibition, which explores 400 years of New York City's past, present, and future. This entire series is being presented in honor of Hilary Ballin, who was the curator of the Future City Lab and of several of our exhibitions over the past decade, and is being sponsored by Saville Studley, who has made all of the events in this series possible, and we very much appreciate their support, as well as the support of our series partners and affiliates, especially the New School and Climate Nexus, who have been instrumental in helping us spread the word on these events, as well as our media partner for tonight, which is Edible Manhattan. So we really appreciate all that they've done to publicize the events, and you can find a full list of our affiliates in your print programs. I'd also like to let you know that all the programs in this series, including this one, are being recorded and will air on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and will also be available online on our website after they air. And I'd also like to tell you about the next event in this series, which is called Reduce, Reuse, Rethink, about the future of waste in New York City, and that will be taking place again here on June 21st at 6:30 p.m., and you can register as for this one at mcny.org/future. So very much hope to see you there. So for tonight's event, what we really should be talking about is the global rise or the global shift, rather, to American-style diets and American levels of consumption, which is having perhaps the largest impact on climate change globally. And similarly, during the energy panel, someone said something like, you know, this is great, but what we really need to be talking about is energy use in the food system, in the production, distribution, and preparation of food. If we don't address that, all the other stuff that we're talking about right now may not have much of an effect. And similarly, during the water panel, as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion about agriculture and the fact that we happen to have a lot of precipitation here, but someone said, you know, with changing patterns of drought and precipitation globally, it's going to put huge pressures on our land base and agriculture, and it's going to change our entire food system. So what I'm getting at is, again and again, when we talk about issues of climate change and urbanization, food comes up not as a tangential or a niche issue, but as something that's really central and critical to understanding these processes. And indeed, in our current era of global urbanization and the rise of cities is due largely due to changes in the food system, so specifically to changes in agricultural production and distribution, so for most of human history, most people were directly involved in the production of food. And that state of affairs has changed quite recently, allowing for and spurring the largest migration in human history from rural areas to cities. We're just beginning to grapple with the implications of this. And there's really no better place to do so than from where we sit right now in New York City, with our incredible cultural and culinary diversity, where we're blessed with 7 million acres of farmland within 200 miles of the city and plentiful precipitation. But this is also a place of excessive consumption and waste, with 9.5 million tons of food distributed throughout the 5 boroughs annually, 1.5 million of which is then shipped out as food waste. And also a place of glaring disparities, home to some of the best food and the best restaurants on the planet, but also home to over 1 million people who are food insecure, struggling to put food on their table every day. So we're in a great place to talk about this, and we're very lucky to have some of the best people with us tonight to talk about the future of food. Dan Barber is a chef and the co-owner of Blue Hill and Blue Hill at Stone Barns, and the author of The Third Plate, Field Notes on the Future of Food. Appointed by President Obama to serve on the President's Council on Physical Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition, Barber continued the work that began with the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture, bringing the principles of good farming directly to the table. He has received multiple James Beard Awards and has been featured in the Netflix documentary series Chef's Table, and his restaurant, Blue Hill at Stone Barns, is currently ranked 11th in the world. But beyond his culinary accomplishments, he's the first person that we reached out to when considering this topic is that he's not someone who's content to accept received wisdom or conventional assumptions about what constitutes good or sustainable food, but he's someone who brings a spirit of relentless curiosity and questioning to the topic of how we can eat in a way that supports and sustains natural systems rather than simply minimizing harm. And I strongly encourage you to read his book, which is available upstairs at our bookshop. Julia Moskin is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist as of Monday. And a native New Yorker, named after Julia Child, in fact, and has been a staff reporter at the New York Times since 2004. She reports news, writes profiles, and spots trends like ramen, funfetti, and Korean fried chicken, which she wrote about before any other US journalist, and has written on such diverse subjects as the punk vegan movement, illegal traffic in Girl Scout cookies, the best recipe for mac and cheese, and sexual harassment at high-end restaurants. She's also the author or co-author of numerous cookbooks, and her rich background in writing and thinking about food makes her the ideal conversation partner for Dan, and so we're in for a real treat tonight. With that, I'd like to ask you to please silence anything that buzzes or beeps, but feel free to tweet using the hashtag MCNYLive, and please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage.
I just heard this amazing news backstage. I want to share it with the audience. I mean, she just won the Pulitzer Prize. But on a historical note, which I was also learning, but with Julia, as I've known Julia for a few years, and I know how humble and how lovely she is, but also how she is not a self-promoter. But she did end up telling me that this is the first Pulitzer for a food section that she knows about, right? Mm-hmm. That you know about. There's a Pulitzer from Jonathan Gold, who's a wonderful writer for the LA Times, but doesn't do the kind of work that Julia does, and I just find it amazing. I mean, this is amazing, and a real testament to both your talent, but also the New York Times and the food section, and the recognition that food and the culture that surrounds food is getting the kind of credence and recognition that it deserves.
That was very exciting for me and my writing partner, Kim Severson, because you don't go into food writing to get praised as a journalist. In fact, many journalists barely recognize food as a valid topic of journalism. Although, of course, that has changed a lot over the last 20 years that I've been doing this. Yeah. Partly because of people like you, Dan Barber.
Oh, come on. You're giving it back.
But
anyway, it's a moment to really recognize and to say congratulations, and I'm so thrilled for you.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Thank you for clapping. It makes them very happy. Okay, we're not here to talk about me. We are here to talk about the future of food in New York. We're just going to decide right here tonight how it's all going to go.
Yeah, good.
Okay,
right,
so just take notes. Obviously, you guys know who Dan is, and the kind of work that he does that is so far beyond really what any other chef in America does in terms of studying agronomy, history, all sorts of culinary topics and non-culinary topics. And I think there is a lot of disagreement in the food community, which includes, farmers, chefs, producers, people who, use Roundup, people who have never heard of Roundup, about what role cities can play in sustaining agriculture and food into the future. So I think probably for the people here, we're probably all people who have tried to buy or are constantly trying to buy more local produce, right?
Do the right thing.
New York is a big, dense city in the middle of the most populated region in the United States. And yet what I hear all the time from farmers, and I'm sure you do too, is we can't make a living. This is not sustainable. We're going out of business. Why do you think that is? Why is it so difficult for the city and the country to interact?
I set out to write a book many years ago, not to answer that question, but actually to come at it from a very different angle, which was to celebrate this movement of farm to table and to tell a story about my relationship with this direct connection with these incredible farmers and the connection and the opportunity that us urban people have to farming and agriculture and deliciousness. And I started the book with a farmer named Klaus Martens, who became the hero of my book. I'd say he's like the donkey of the book because he carries the story of the book, and I didn't know I needed a donkey for a book, but he was the first literally the first chapter in my mind because he supplied wheat to us at the restaurant, and it was really delicious. I baked this bread with 100% of emer wheat, this wheat that he was growing on his farm, and I just became very well known as a chef who was devoted to local agriculture, but especially like going beyond it with grain, and so we baked this bread that everyone would sell their firstborn for another slice of, and I decided to start the book by going out to tell the farm to stable story, to tell the story of like how an urban environment and populace could connect to and sustain a sustainable agriculture community outside of New York City, and through the story of this local wheat. And anyway, I'm there. I'm like the first hour of visiting Klaus Martins. I'm on his farm. I'm looking out. He's 2,400 acres surrounding me, and I don't see like any wheat at all. And here I am visiting the farm to write about the wheat, right? And what I saw instead was like barley and buckwheat and millet. I saw a ton of like leguminous crops, like chickpeas even, and fava beans and peas and cowpeas, and I saw cover crops like clover and vetch and the rest. But I saw very little wheat in my standing on this perch overlooking his farm, and it was at that moment that the question that you're asking and the incredibly long answer that I'm taking to answer it, became just shifted its focus completely for me, because I realized that here I was as a chef being celebrated for a farm to table philosophy, and yet of all the things that I mentioned, all the crops I mentioned, the dozens of crops, I mentioned only a few of them, but really dozens of crops, I wasn't buying any of the other crops. I was only buying the wheat, and the wheat represented a tiny slice of his agricultural pie. And what I learned in the next, half an hour or so, was that the rest of the agriculture pie was what he was growing to support the wheat. In other words, all these crops, the barleys, the buckwheats, the leguminous crops, the cover crops, and the rest, they were all there planted in a meticulously timed rotation, which was meant to provide the soil with the kind of health, vitality, biological activity that enabled the wheat to grow so strong and make it so delicious that I became the celebrated chef that I had become. And what I realized at that moment was I was like the emperor without clothes, because I was buying just this tiny little sliver, and the rest of it was what went into supporting the wheat, except he had no market for the rest. There is no market for buckwheat. There is no market for the leguminous crops. There is no market for the cover crops. And so what he did with the rest of the pie is dump it into animal feed, or more often than not, just plowed it back into the ground like a sunk real estate, sunk cost. And at that moment, I felt like the emperor without clothes, because I was celebrating for something that I was really not thinking in a way that supported the entirety of the farm, and that changed my life, and it changed my cooking.
So that was the moment when you realized just buying this particular farmer's wheat was not enough, because you had to think more about
system.
His entire farm.
It was the whole system. In the same way that we talk about nose to tail of an animal, we rarely talk about the nose tail of a farm. And the nose tail of a farm is very complex. And for an organic farmer, a lot of it is a sunk cost, because there's no market for those lowly crops that are soil supporting, that are necessary for the king crops like wheat and corn and rice. Those are the Hummers of the food world.
Like
those
the things
ones that
people
suck up the
will
fertility.
pay for.
Right, and we pay a ton for the wheat, but it actually supports the entirety of the system.
So we should be eating more millet, and that would help?
Well, I went back to my restaurant. I created Rotation Risotto, which was thank you for laughing at my humor. The risotto was a risotto of everything except for the wheat. It was a soil supporting risotto. It was before we served the bread at the restaurant. So essentially, what I was saying is, if you want to have your bread, here's what you have to eat to get the bread. And it was something but that was a late inning revelation. That only happened a few years ago, and it changed the course of the book. And it took me 10 years to write the book, which is a lot of the reason why, because I realized like this whole farm to table ideal is so small. It's that sliver of wheat. It's I can go to a farmer's market and treat it like a supermarket. I can buy the zucchini and the tomatoes and the eggplant in the middle of summer and call myself a farm to table chef, when in fact you are literally buying the Hummers of the soil farmscape, and everything else is planted to support those crops that I've just picked. And that sounded ridiculous to me, embarrassing to me. Yeah.
For us as consumers, if we wanted to buy the millet or whatever is the vegetable equivalent or the fruit equivalent or the dairy equivalent,
of the in-between crops,
how should we do that?
Well, the grain equivalent would be the crops that millet is one big one. I like in a changing climate where rains come ferociously and then not for a long time. Millet is a magical crop. No wonder that it ruled North Africa in the same way that lentils ruled India, in the same way that rye ruled Europe, in the same way that buckwheat ruled a lot of Asia, especially Japan, in the same way that beans ruled South America. I mean, all of these crops were the rotation crops into, in South America, corn, in Asia, rice, and in Europe, wheat, which built those civilizations. But that's not the right story. The right story is all of the other crops that are so much of what you write about, or your section writes about on Food Writers write about all the time, which is the peasant crops, the crops that peasants needed to grow, that they knew they needed to grow to get the king crops. And what I was doing was celebrating on the king crop, but not the other crops. And so, I think part of the, back to your question, is part of the responsibility, or part of the opportunity for urban eaters is to support the nose to tail of a landscape. And that's not one nose to tail. That's, what is the nose to tail of the Hudson Valley for us is very different from what the nose to tail of where I was this past week in Georgia in the South, or what it is in Michigan, or what it is in Southern California, which means that the diets have to be very different.
I had all week, I have had a dairy farmer trolling me on Twitter.
Okay, and
saying,
how's that working out for you? Yeah.
Saying, how can you not have a farmer on this panel?
Okay.
And I said, finally I responded and I said, well, if you were going to ask Dan Barber one question, what would it be?
God.
She wrote back saying, ask Dan Barber.
Yeah.
It's
Did you
very
put
gentle.
the blame on me
It's
and
not
said that
scary.
there's not a farmer on here because of me, or you said,
No.
okay, all right, I just want to make sure.
And what she said, actually, she, of course, like most trolls, she caved under a wave of kindness. And she said,
Is that
how
true
can
of
we-
trolls? That's
It is
good
true.
advice.
If
If you push back, it's all right.
No, in a loving way. Like
you embrace
open,
them.
Exactly.
So okay.
I said, I'll ask Dan whatever you want.
Yeah,
So
nice.
she said, ask Dan, how can dairy farmers make New Yorkers fall in love with their product?
Yeah. Well, that's, she's asking.
Because milk, of course, is something that we
Yeah.
often, I'm sure
Overlook,
you guys
yeah.
might be thinking in terms of local milk, but for the vast majority of American consumers, milk is a
Yes,
commodity
milk is milk,
like
yeah.
gasoline.
Right. And she's asking the right guy, because Blue Hill Farm is a dairy, as you know, in Western Massachusetts. And I'll give the answer from the perspective of somebody who,
Well, let's tell
who runs the dairy.
everyone what Blue Hill Farm is.
Yeah, Blue Hill
Getting
Farm
back to
is
your roots.
Blue Hill Farm is a 160 acre farm in Western Massachusetts that my grandmother started 50 years ago, and she took over from a dairy that had been pasturing dairy cows on a landscape for 100 years. When she died, the farm switched over to beef cattle for a while, and my brother and I took it over. We did it because we didn't have at Stone Barns, where my other restaurant is in Westchester, we did everything meat and grains and vegetables, but no dairy. And so it seemed like an opportunity to fill the void with dairy through our farm, and to return it to what it was initially, which was a pastured livestock for dairy. And my answer to the question is in part goes back to what we were just talking about, is looking at the whole farm and creating a market for the nose to tail of a dairy farm. What's the nose to tail of a dairy farm is veal, because 50% of what's born on a dairy farm is male, and male calves don't obviously give milk, and so for 99.9999% of the dairies, the first thing that you do when a male is born is get it the hell off the farm. In many cases, you kill it, because getting it off the farm is actually too expensive. actually getting someone to pick it up and raise it for veal, because there's not a market for veal. There's not a big market for veal. Most of these cows are compost. And what we've done is created a outlet for veal. So 50% of what's born on our farm every year becomes veal for our restaurants. And so we have a large veal program at our farm. And that's not just tenderloin of veal, a rack of veal. It is all the animal, because we only buy the whole animal. So that's created a whole different kind of cuisine for me. It's forced me, in the same way that peasants in France, because that's a dairy culture, was forced into creating these incredibly delicious dishes based on veal agriculture, because that was part of dairy agriculture, which was the backbone of much of northern France's cuisine. And at times it's quite frustrating, but at other times it's quite liberating, because it's creative, and it's forcing me into a negotiation with the system of dairy that would be too easy to opt out of. In this case, I own the farm, so I can't really opt out of it. But it's a very, very interesting way to, market a dairy farm through veal.
Well, it is interesting also because I think many of us think of veal as like
Yeah,
morally
tortured animal.
objectionable.
Yeah.
Like the one thing that we're like, I do not buy veal. In fact, I tried to buy some ground veal at Trader Joe's the other day,
And
the clerk looked at me and said, "We don't sell veal."
Yeah, well,
And I felt a little embarrassed that I even wanted
I think
some
you
veal.
should go back into them tomorrow and say, I don't know about that, because if you're the Hudson Valley and you don't eat veal, you're not supporting dairies. And the problem with dairies goes back to what this troller was saying, which is we've got a real problem with the landscape of the Hudson Valley was built on dairy. Like all those sight lines that we enjoy and we call the Hudson Valley was dairy, because this landscape was perfectly suited to pasturing dairy. And that's what built the Hudson Valley, and we should acknowledge that and support it in a way that's actually more passionate than supporting vegetables, because vegetables for the Hudson Valley is actually not that sustainable from an economic point of view.
Can you say more about that? That's very radical.
It is
The idea that we should not be buying.
No,
local
I'm not saying
vegetables.
not buying. I'm just saying what I sort of bristle at is the vegans and vegetarians who say, that there's holier than now aspect to being in this place where we're sitting now and being a vegetarian or vegan. That's crazy. It's look outside today. It's April 18th, and it's 32 degrees when we woke up this morning. So it's like, how in the world do you really view supporting a landscape? The landscape is telling you what it needs to grow. And we have one of the great grass agricultures in the world. And we should be taking advantage of that through meat and dairy. That does not mean that we should be eating only cheese and 6 or 7 ounces of steak twice a day, 7 days a week. That's the Western conception of a plate of food, a protein-centric plate of food. That's crazy, because no ecology will support that, obviously. But there is a defense, I think, to eating meat and enjoying dairy, because we enjoy both the landscape that produced it and the ecological conditions that support it.
But I mean, the landscape, in a way, that seems very highfalutin, I must say. Like, so we want to have the perfect hills and the rolling grass. I mean, don't we want a sustainable food system?
But what's
more
not
than
sustainable
what we
about
want?
meat and dairy if you're eating it in the right proportions?
I don't know.
Well,
I'm asking.
if you're not feeding and I'll just say it from, this will sound even more highfalutin for you, but for Blue Hill, we don't feed a lick of grain to our animals. So we are doing 100% grass-fed dairy and 100% grass-fed veal, and therefore we're harvesting the energy of the sun in a local context. What is more sustainable than that?
And besides veal, there are others. Like, does buttermilk fit into that?
Sure, buttermilk and
Cycle?
whey, and you make yogurt and cheese from that dairy, and all of a sudden you have a byproduct which is nutritious and delicious, and you make a whole set of great dishes out of that.
I feel like I'm being offered a lot of whey on menus these days.
Because smaller organic grass-fed dairies are actually booming in the Hudson Valley, because people are recognizing it for the flavor. I think chefs have led that, but also they're recognizing it for the health benefits, because cows on grass versus cows on grain is a big difference.
But from a culinary perspective, like
from a culinary
if I wanted to cook
from a culinary
some whey,
perspective, there's nothing like a cow that's fed only grass, or from beef cow that's.
Oh no,
fed
I mean
only
in
grass.
terms of eating the whey. How should I be could I be eating whey or cooking with it?
How could you be using more
Or
whey?
should I just
mean,
drink
we
it
use
raw?
Whey, we use whey in everything, from vinaigrettes to sauces to purees. I mean, we use it because
The
it has
way
a
that-
tang and a complexity that has its own natural acidity. That's fantastic. I mean, it's literally fantastic. The problem with the run to, like, let's say Greek yogurt, which is 10 years ago, if we were on the stage talking about Greek yogurt, everyone would be like, what the hell is Greek yogurt? But today it's everywhere. And the problem with that is that the byproduct of Greek yogurt is whey. But what's happened to the whey is that it's being dumped in soils in upstate New York because there's no market for whey. You just said, well, I'm being offered whey a lot, but you are the highfalutin elitist. Most people don't really sit there because our culture doesn't create we're not like Greece. We don't marinate our leg of lamb in whey, or like Sweden, where you have these elixirs in the summer that are incredibly delicious and nutritious and terrific for your biome and stuff. That's inculcated into the norms of the culture and part of the cuisine. That's what cuisine is. It forces you to not just enjoy the strained off yogurt. It forces you to take the byproduct and have it as. But they don't call it waste. They inculcate it into their everyday mores and food habits, and that's what cuisine is so valuable. We don't have that tradition. Actually, that is the Achilles heel of the American food system. Is of the American food cultures. We have no culture. We never were forced into the kind of negotiations that all the peasants of the world were forced into in all the great cuisines of the world. They could not afford to eat high on the hog as the United States of America was able to do, because we're a young country and because we have unbelievable soil fertility and because we actually have rainfall east of the Mississippi. All these things and we have a geography that's just unprecedented, and like nobody had that. Everyone else was living off of 4,000 years of exhausted soils, and so they had to figure out, how do you create rotations? You can't just live off of wheat and corn and rice, which is what the Western diet is. You have to live off the in-between crops. And you can't just live off dairy. You have to live off the veal calves, and you have to live off the whey that's strained off of dairy to make cheese. The Italians created Parmigiano Reggiano. They didn't take the whey and throw it away. They created prosciutto di Parma. Now, that's a nice culinary invention that's quite highfalutin, but actually is rooted in peasantry. It's the use of a waste product from one delicious cheese to make an absolutely stunningly delicious meat. That's a cuisine. That's an interconnected food system that is very much flies in the face of the farm-to-table ethic, because the farm-to-table ethic allows you to do single ingredients, allows you to buy a local cheese or a local Parmesan and call yourself, like I used to, a savior of local agriculture. But that's crazy. It's really in the way and the creation of new products through the way that you get to a mature food system that is connected and I think much more sustainable.
Whey and waste lead to mention of your restaurant. What was it called?
It was called Wasted.
It was called Wasted.
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, I think it was called Garbage. I can't remember. But and
A lot of people called it garbage. It's okay.
I went there and I had my
We had trollers.
the beef tallow candles.
Oh, you did. You were there.
I was there, yeah. And at Stone Barns, you've taken me on a tour of your charcoal burning compost heap, or maybe those are different things, and all of that stuff. So food waste is obviously now kind of where you have invested a lot of energies.
Yeah.
I mean, are we really going to be cooking with carrot tops and eating and making candles, or is that just
and eating whey?
and eating whey?
Yeah. Well, but I mean, a lot of that idea.
Like, what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? So there's two ways to answer. First is that I started the Wasted pop-up. I turned the restaurant in New York into a pop-up for a month and devoted it to just wasted food that we otherwise throw away, food that we consider uncoveted, and created a menu out of it that Julia is referring to.
And it was delicious.
Thank you. And it was a little provocative, but more so it was meant to be really delicious. And the reason that I approached this idea was because I was so frustrated by chefs being looked at as feeders of waste, as we were unsympathetic to this idea that food was being that 40% of the food that we produce is thrown away. I was like, this is the craziest thing. Chefs the DNA of a chef is to take what is unused or uncoveted and transmutate it into something that sings. Tonight on the menu, I have a braised lamb ravioli with spring vegetables. I'm selling it, I don't know, for $18 or whatever, right? And like, I could just so easily say what it is. I'll tell you what it is because you're not going to eat at the restaurant tonight. It's leftover braised lamb shanks that I didn't sell last night, and I cut it up with offcuts of vegetables that I didn't sell last night, and I mixed it together with a bit of cheese and stuffed in a ravioli. So I could call that's waste. It's waste. In the same way that, so I should be calling it waste ravioli. That's why I opened the pop-up to wear it on my sleeve. This is waste. But in the same way that a coq au vin is waste. What's a coq au vin? A coq au vin is a rooster. You ever tried to roast a rooster? I mean, it tastes like that. But take oxidized wine from the region of Burgundy and braise it very, very gently, and you have coq au vin. You didn't call it wasted chicken soup. What's a bouillabaisse? A bouillabaisse is the fish that the wives of fishermen kept back from selling at the market because they knew it wouldn't sell. It was damaged fish. It was ripped fish. It was fish that were caught in nets that were uncoveted and unknown, and they mixed it all into this incredibly delicious and unctuous soup called a bouillabaisse. They didn't call it wasted fish. But if you look at the history of all the great cuisines of the world, that's the basis of every dish. So I wanted to create a pop-up where we started talking about that, not the low-hanging fruit of the ugly fruits and vegetables, which is where the wasted movement seems to have gone, which is, I understand, it's quite easy because it's you can touch and feel that, and it seems like actionable, and so that there's something worthy about it. But the ugly fruits and vegetables, the expired dairy, all the stuff that's talked about with the waste movement, it's just like it's nothing compared to the larger issue of our food system, which goes back to what we were just talking about, which is the wasted food, the food that wasted in the sense that we have 120 million acres of corn grown in this country. We eat directly like less than 1/10 of 1% of that 120 million acres. It goes to feeding our gas tanks, and it goes to feeding cows, and then we eat the meat from the cows. That is extremely inefficient, besides all the extraordinary environmental problems that's associated with that kind of agriculture. It's just incredibly inefficient. It's wasteful. What if we took 120 million acres and we turned that into the rotation crops that I saw on the hilltop overlooking Klaus Martin's field? Now you've got a suite of not just healthy soil-supporting grains, but deliciousness. You've got hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of acres, 120 million acres of incredible nutritious crops to feed a country that increasingly wants to democratize the flavors that I get to serve in my restaurant every night. So that's where I think the wasted conversation go, and that's why I wanted to do the wasted pop-up, was to expand the conversation, say it's not just ugly fruits and vegetables and expired dairy. Actually, it's our damn food choices. It's our westernized conception of what we expect for a plate of food twice a day, 7 days a week. It's preposterous. And no culture and no country in the history of the world has ever expected that, because it's preposterous. But yet we believe that it's all right as Americans, and we're exporting that idea to the rest of the world. And that's frightening, and we should turn it on its head and look at wastefulness and inefficiency in the light of pleasure and deliciousness. So that was my shift in this whole thing.
No, that's very, I think
that didn't all come across when you ate dinner.
No.
Yeah, well.
What was the charcoal again?
What was the what?
The charcoal?
The charcoal was bones from, so we buy whole animals, we have these bones, we make this beautiful stocks and sauces out of the bones. They give off this rich collagen and deliciousness and a lot of nutrition, as nutritionists are discovering. And then we throw them away. And we discovered that maybe there's one more step to this. What if we took them and we carbonized them, we made them into charcoal, and then, which is what we do at the restaurant at Stone Barns, we created a carbonizer, a machine that cooks the bones, roasts the bones without lighting them on fire, creating a charcoal bone. And then we take the bone, we put it in our grill, and we light it, and it grills our meats. So what you have when you come to eat it at our restaurant is a leg of pork roasted on its own bones. And it gives a kind of flavor and an experience.
Is that kosher, Dan?
I wouldn't describe it as that.
I'm sorry.
But there is a high ideal there. So in
it
that
is
sense,
amazing,
it's kosher.
and there is no one else who has taken it to that extreme, and it is really amazing.
Thank you.
That you,
Well,
that you would look at that and say, what more can I do
Yeah, what more can
to
you do?
these bones that have already been on a plate and in a roasting pan and in a stock pot? There must be more.
Yeah, squeezing a lemon.
So the larger food system, and you were talking about, the 120, all the corn and the soybeans and all of the crop problems. As consumers, I feel like it's very confusing to prioritize. Like,
Yeah,
should I
what do
be
you do?
prioritizing human rights? Should I be prioritizing the environment? Should I be prioritizing local? I mean, do you balance all of those things on an individual basis for all of your ingredients?
Yeah,
or is there an overarching
No, I have
vision?
a simplistic calculus, and it's deliciousness. But real deliciousness, and again, I know that sounds highfalutin, but I'll try and just quickly explain that. Like, let's just take a carrot, a delicious carrot, and I'm not talking about a carrot that was glazed in like honey or sugar. I'm talking about just a carrot naked on its own that is so jaw-droppingly delicious that you take a bite of it and like a Burgundy or a Bordeaux, you taste it, 10 minutes later, has real permanence, and you think about it. That is what chefs are driven for, is this true, deep, rich flavor that is produced from all the things that you just mentioned. I just want to prove that. How can you have this carrot that I just described, this jaw-droppingly delicious carrot, without really good soil, for example? You can't. I mean, I know that for sure. You cannot have an experience like I just described without soil that's really alive, really biologically diverse, full of fertility. But how do you get soil that's full of fertility? Well, you have to have rotation crops to do that. You have to have compost and a farmer that's willing to invest the energy and the time to make the soil create the kind of biological conditions that give you that kind of flavor. Okay, well, that's a very healthy soil environment that's trapping carbon from the air and improving the chances for less CO2 release into the air. And you're talking about a farmer that's probably small and regional, because a very large farm is not doing the kind of attention I just talked about. So you're probably supporting a local regional economy. And if you're supporting a local regional economy, you're probably supporting a very diverse farm. And if you're supporting a very diverse farm, you're probably supporting a farm that's filled with social justice, because there is no way that a small diverse farm can pay anything but a living wage. So all of a sudden you get to the politics and social justice issues of food production. And you also, by the way, cannot have a jaw-droppingly delicious carrot without flavonoids, without nutrient density, because flavonoids and nutrient density are flavor. This is one and the same thing. So all of a sudden you have not just flavor and highfalutin stuff, but you have real nutrition, true suite of nutrition that's provable. And you have the social conditions and political conditions that are attached to producing that carrot. All of a sudden, the carrot becomes a lot more complicated by just pursuing very simply the flavor. And that's where, as a chef, I try and focus my calculus, because the flavor tends to have knock-on benefits that are really provable and very exciting.
So what really all that takes for us, I think, is just paying attention to taste more, and not just thinking a carrot is a carrot is a carrot.
Yes, and also I think chefs play a big role here, because we curate this stuff every day. In the same way that museums curate great art and great exhibits, chefs curate this stuff. And whether a chef is, a Republican to heart or a Democrat or in between or anything, or not apolitical, the DNA of a chef is to pursue those flavors. And by definition, when you pursue those flavors, you're pursuing the kinds of things that I just talked about. And I do think that connection is real and ought to be explored more and advertised more. And luckily, we live in a world where I have a voice. I'm sitting here on stage with you tonight instead of cooking in my kitchen. It's a little weird.
No, and I'm sitting here thinking about the baby carrots in the plastic bags.
Yeah.
That I don't really think about that much. And
Right.
I buy them, but every so often, like in the bag, there's like 3 of them that are really disturbing.
Right. You found those. I found those too. Yeah.
And I didn't think of those in terms of like, okay,
It's
a
not
bag
enough
of carrots
to
that includes those
it's
things
not
that have
enough
no
to-
taste
right.
and are not, they're just not okay.
Right. It's not enough to just eat more fruits and vegetables, although that is very important. It's more to think about this in the ways that you just mentioned. It's becoming more educated. And I think that the ticket to that is chefs have this ability this opportunity to follow flavor and to educate through that. And it's actually very exciting. What the hell kind of movement asks you to indulge in pleasure and hedonism. Like, I don't know. I mean, look at the environmental movement. It's always asking you to give up stuff. And then religion, everything is about giving up. I mean, that's why the food movement is so great. It's like, I mean, I don't know. Because I always get asked, don't you think the local thing, the food, the clean food, good food movement has hit its apex? I'm like, no way. It's like, it's rooted in pleasure. And, I bemoan a lot of things about the American food culture. There's one thing the American food culture is good at. It's chasing and paying more for pleasure.
And making
We're
things
greedy,
taste good.
and we're greedy. That's good. Greedy for the right kind of food is very, very exciting.
What's your secret junk food vice?
Yeah,
weakness?
Jesus.
What is it?
I'm so
You must have
racked
one.
with guilt. I don't have room for a junk food.
No nacho
guilt.
cheese Dorito ever.
I mean, my wife's in the audience. I got to be careful that I don't. Yeah, I don't like associate the guilt thing with the pleasure thing. I find there's so much to luxuriate in
It
these
is hard
flavors.
also
I'm not-
once
yeah.
you learn a certain amount about
Yeah.
certain foods, it is hard to enjoy them. And when you learn what all of the ingredients in the nacho cheese Doritos and how they're
Yeah.
kind of all different versions of
Yeah,
soybeans,
it doesn't make
and
me
corn.
hungry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but then again, I'm not such a snob that I don't recognize that sugar and fat and salt is great. But I'm more interested in the things that have a lasting taste. I think most chefs are. Yeah.
So obviously you are a person who is in the vanguard of food and of agriculture. Are there particular concepts, technologies, trends, things that are, obviously I'm sure people bring you things all the time that you feel like are really the things that will help us transform not only what we eat, but New York's food system? Is it like vertical farms in New York Harbor?
I'm not
is
a
it
fan.
kelp? Is
Yeah,
it lab-grown meat? Like all the things that I get press
I'm
releases.
not a fan of lab-grown
What about
meat.
crickets?
Have you tasted lamb-grown meat?
No, I have.
I'm not a fan of crickets because if I was in South America, I'd be a fan of crickets, but or insects. I get it. But I'm like, we're in the Hudson Valley. I don't get that at all. It's not that it's not delicious. It's just that for the ecological conditions that we're talking about where we're sitting, it's like, what the hell are we chasing ants for? That doesn't make any sense. Actually, dairy makes a lot more sense, especially grass that's fed by free sunlight, free solar energy, and that grass gets fed to an herbivore. An herbivore converts healthy grasses into fats that feed you. That's intense. I mean, that's awesome. Like we can't go out and chew the lawn out in Central Park right now, right? There's an herbivore that was put on the earth to do that and to derive the energy and deliciousness from that meat and milk and cheese and yogurt and et cetera. It's really amazing. I'm more interested in exploring that.
So you are more looking
Back?
I mean, in terms of technology, less technology.
No,
more.
I'm not a Luddite. I'm like really turned on by new technologies in the service of better ecological functions. I'm really psyched about it. Like I just started this seed company where we're taking a lot of the older varieties of seeds, like the heirlooms of the past, and updating them by introducing new varieties, like marrying them, to create new varieties that are more disease resistant, that give better yield for the farmer so that the farmer makes money, and actually democratizing these flavors that I get to enjoy every night. That's what I want the second part of the 2.0 of my life to be, because I don't know any chef that does, but I really don't love the idea of keeping this in this closed system of the white tablecloth restaurant. I think it's preposterous, and it's actually literally is preposterous because you don't need to do that. Like we can take these technologies. We have genome mapping, and we have molecular structures and I'm not talking about genetically modified ingredients, seeds. I'm talking about real old world seed hybridization that we can do with modern technology, simple computer program to predict stuff, to make new seeds that our great grandparents would have taken their lifetime to do, that we can do in 3 or 4 years. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. We just have to ask. And that's why I did the company, was to start this idea around like chefs who like me, who talk about heirlooms and old flavors to like save the world. It's crazy. That stuff is just really unproductive. Agronomic, it's totally risky investment for a farmer. And I'm very turned on by the idea that we can preserve the old flavors, but modernize them to greater yield and encourage more organic farming and encourage this democratization of these flavors and tastes and nutrition that should be democratized. But they start up high and they bleed.
Of course, is for some people it makes their hair stand on end, and they say that's genetic engineering. Those
Yeah.
are GMOs. They're not natural.
No, GMOs is taking a genetic trait or a DNA structure from another source. So in other words, it's taking a pig's blood, a pig's heart DNA and inserting it into a carrot, because a pig's blood has a certain kind of nutrition suite that we want to introduce into carrots. That's what GMO technology is. Most of the GMO technology has been worked on in pursuit of being able to spray noxious pesticides and fungicides on crops that don't die. So they tweak the genetic structure to be able to allow these really virulent chemical additions to agriculture that allows the crop to grow a little bit more productively. That's what you just described is not genetic modification, it's transgenic. That's what GMO is. It's just misnamed. Transgenic means that in nature this would never happen. You would never get a pig's heart DNA into a carrot. It's just that doesn't cross. But that's what GMO technology is.
But you could get two different kinds of carrots to cross.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
what I'm
maybe
interested in
a
is the
carrot
two different
and
What I'm interested in is two different carrots that could possibly come together because of birds and bees and wind blowing through cross-pollination. But we're making that happen. And we're doing it now in the most advanced technologies, which is computer programming and understanding where these two varieties come together. They're going to create something really unbelievable, not just for your tongue, but for a farmer who's trying to fight off new fungal diseases, and for a farmer that wants the kind of yield that allows him or her to stay on their farm. And that, to me, that's the pursuit of good technology married with a lot of old world wisdom. The transgenic stuff just doesn't interest me because it's in pursuit of largely
Commercial
huge
goals.
commercial and corporate investments that allow you to do nefarious things, which is why 95% of new seeds that are developed in the United States of America are in the hands of three companies. Three companies. We talk about we're scared about monopolies of like Apple, or what's the other monopoly?
AT&T.
AT&T. It's like, what? Like Monsanto and Bayer coming together is this craziest thing. 95%. The scariest part is that 95% of the three companies that own 95% of the future of our food supply are chemical companies. They're not seed companies. They couldn't give a shit about seeds. Seeds are lost leaders. They lose money on the seeds. They make money on the chemicals. And so they're breeding, there's so many problems in this. It's like Trumpian. It's like, where is that? Why would a seed company that doesn't make money on the seeds, that's owned by a chemical company, what investment, what encouragement do they have to create a seed that's strong and healthy? And by the way, strong and healthy is delicious and nutritious. If they make the money on the chemicals, on the intervention, there's none. There's none. So that's why I wanted to start the company, was to look at this in a very different way. Yeah.
Well, I've asked all my questions. I hope you guys have some, and you can raise your hands.
When you were talking about kind of like the Western expectation for, how much food is going to be on your plate, do we back away from that at all? Maybe like during the Great Depression?
I mean, the Great Depression was from what I researched for my book, I'm not an expert in it at all, but was a great example of what was possible with leftovers and reuse of what we would otherwise consider, in our history, in American food history, to be unworthy of the table. So that was an important time. But I look back at the soil crisis of the 1820s as like the most pivotal time in American history. I don't know if that's too exaggerated. That we don't talk about enough. Not the most pivotal time in American history, but the most pivotal time in American history that's not accentuated enough. It was the soil crisis. The southern food agriculture was producing not just food for our entire growing country, but it was producing food for the rest of the world. We were exporting. We were exporting more rice than any other Asian country in the world by 10 times. And we had a soil collapse in the 1820s. And I'm bringing that up only because it forced into what we know today as Southern agriculture and Southern food culture. Southern food culture came out of a crisis. And the crisis was that farmers left. And where did they go? They dropped their plows and went to the Midwest. And that plowed up the prairie. And who stayed behind were largely slaves and plantation owners who couldn't move. And the slaves were the ones who knew from North Africa about soil rotation, and that what we were doing was simply mining soil fertility, and that we couldn't possibly produce the kind of crops we were producing and export it to the rest of the world for long. And that's when they brought in peanuts, and they brought in as a leguminous crop as part of the rotations, and they brought in Hoppin' John's is like a great example of that kind of dish that came out of the Hoppin' John's is rice and cowpeas. Cowpea before 1820 was an animal feed. When they could no longer feed it to animals, but you had to eat it, they created this dish of rice and 50% rice, 50% cowpeas. And they had collard greens, and collard greens were introduced by slaves because in North Africa there were salinated soils, and that's what happened in the 1820s. You had salinated soils, and collard greens soaked up the salinity, and so that became a big part of Southern agriculture. Peanuts and collard greens and the rest of these crops that we think of today as celebrating Southern, we're really celebrating a reversal out of desperation. And to me, it's a fascinating time because it was truly a cuisine. It wasn't just individual products. It was a cuisine that united the push to create fertility back into the soils that were once rich, and created. And what was most fascinating to me when I was writing the book was like it was all rooted in deliciousness. It was not just about like let's just produce grub so we can feed people calories. It was like still a time of this like amazing breeding and like this experimentation with flavors. Hell, we don't look at Southern cuisine as untasty. We look at it as actually our national cuisine. But that came out of desperation in the same way that all these cultures that we celebrate today, food cultures, came out of desperate efforts to create what the land could eke out into something that was nutritious and delicious. So I'm inspired by that.
In terms of the Great Depression, I think the problem was that it also coincided with a huge rise in food technology. So rather than recipes and food creativity coming into play, there was just a lot more canning and a lot more freezing and a lot more just manipulation of food that really started partly out of hardship.
That's right.
Which blossomed along with many other big social movements and ecological issues throughout the 50s and 60s.
I'm wondering if you think there's any hope of scaling up of what I would call responsible farming.
I was just in North Dakota at a farm that is considered mid-size. It was 24,000 acres. 24,000. That's like farming Rhode Island. And the guy farmed it with one tractor and a satellite. He didn't drive. He read magazines in the tractor, and it's amazing. It's amazing. And you would think like me and him, like oil and water. Like this is really Trump land. I mean, this guy like this hardcore. But what he said to me is the same lesson I've been learning, but I need to keep hearing it. Which is, we were sitting in the cab of this monster tractor, and he said, your thing of diversity. He's like, you're a thing of diversity. He's like, but he said very nicely and very to the point. He said, okay, here's what I want you to answer for me. I'm going to grow your buckwheat for you, and then you tell me who's going to pick it up. Okay, who's going to store? What elevator is going to store it, and separate it. Not just store it, but separate it, because you want a certain buckwheat that has the kind of flavor that you're talking to me about. Well, that needs to be separate. So who's going to separate it for me? Well, the closest guy who will take buckwheat in is 3,500 miles from where we're sitting, and he doesn't separate anything. So to separate something, I'd have to pay him probably 10 times what he's doing. And then from there, you have to tell me who's going to pick it up for the distributorship. And from there, you probably have to tell me who's going to buy it. Now, if you can answer those 4 questions, I'll plant your buckwheat. That was it. I was like, man, that's and what he was doing without knowing was turning it back on me, because where's the greatest example of buckwheat in a rotation? It's in Japan. Buckwheat into rice. You can't, back before 1930, you couldn't grow rice in most parts of Japan without buckwheat. It was the fumigator for disease, and it was the yield booster for rice. So what did the Japanese do with the buckwheat? They didn't feed it to cows like our farmer Klaus, the hero of my book, does. And he didn't have a chef like me pointing to the Japanese culture and say, you got to eat more buckwheat. They created soba noodles. And soba became inculcated into the everyday food traditions of what it means to be Japanese. That's a nice rotation, but it doesn't work unless the food culture adopts it. That's why I believe so strongly in the cuisine.
And part of for us, and in terms of what is available to a restaurant to buy. Can they even buy chicken gizzards? No, their trucks don't deliver.
Right,
Like
exactly.
Baldor does not
Right,
deliver
exactly.
chicken gizzards. It takes a
But
very
that's
long
coming.
time.
That's coming.
And it takes a lot
It's coming.
of money.
Yep.
And we in
They
America...
said the same thing about kale, and look at
Yeah.
it. Like, I mean, look at kale when I opened Stone Barns, and kale was the thing that is displayed in those supermarket glass things for that is the garnish for everything. No, but kale became the hottest crop and continues. I mean, the fact that it is in McDonald's now is just testament to the dizzying speed which American food culture takes on these ideas.
And the things that people are willing to pay for.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
the ways
That's
that you
right.
guys spend your money is
That's right.
really making a
Big
difference.
one. And I could give the example of quinoa and sushi and, I don't know, fresh roasted and milled coffee. I mean, if I was sitting here in 1980 and I said to you, there's going to be this joint on every street corner in every urban environment in the United States of America that is just fresh milling coffee beans, you would say that's crazy. People can buy that in their home in a jar. Like, that would never happen. No one's going to pay for that. But it ends up that when people discover the flavor of freshly brewed coffee, they're willing to pay more, and the food culture shifts in a moment. And I said the dizzying speed before. I think there's no better way to say that. That doesn't happen in Japan or Europe partly because they're tethered to food traditions that are still sort of intact. And so I don't know. I don't want to end on such a dystopian note. Like, I think that the positive is that because of this lack of food culture in America, one of the things that we're really good at is pursuing these things. So I actually don't think the change. I mean, what we are living through right now, we're like, my history professor used to say, we're lobsters in boiling water. We have no perspective. We have no perspective of the changes that are happening right now. We are in the greatest fundamental change in our food system in these last 5 years than in the last 500 years. And that's because food companies, when you talk to food executives, they just are turned on their head. Like, everyone is turning away from processed food. People are turning away from ingredients that have, food products that have more than 5 ingredients. These are all new things. Kale, as I mentioned, is coming on. You look at innards of animals are being requested and distribution channels are being created for them. Whole wheat is taking on a whole new dimension for the milling apparatus. Look at barley for beer. Look at the craft brewing industry. If we were sitting here 10 years ago and I said to you, the craft brewing industry, which back then was like less than 1% of the beer industry, I said it's going to become 40% of the U.S. beer consumption. You would have laughed in my face the same way you would have laughed in my face in 1980 about Starbucks. Well, what did the craft brewing industry result in? It resulted in the farmer that I was sitting with on the 24,000 acres now is being paid to grow barley. Well, the barley is one of those soil supporting crops that I started this talk with that needs to be grown. But it's not. He wasn't growing it because someone was pointing a finger and saying you need to grow more barley. He was growing it because he had a market for it. He had a market for it because craft brewing is exploding, and craft brewers demand local barley and high quality barley. That creates a soil supporting crop for rotation into wheat. It creates soil supporting functioning, with more carbon sequestration, more holding capacity for water, more ability for pollinators to attract land. I mean, on and on. The knockoff effects are huge. That's all coming out of beer. It's transforming the landscape of the West Coast, the Midwest, and the East Coast. And that's happened in just 8 years, from 0% to 40%. So the quick answer to your question, which turned out to be too long, is that we have an ability to change the food culture here with great speed and alacrity that I think should be really exciting for our future. Okay.
And as you say, across the lifespan, I think that the one principle is new things. Try new things.
Yeah.
If you see something
At home, yeah, I agree.
but also on a restaurant menu.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if it's a restaurant and a chef that you trust, that you've been there,
Trust
and there's
your
something
local
that's
chef.
weird, you order it.
Give your
because-
local chef a hug.
Yeah, that's, well, I don't think you would like that.
No, that's true. That's true. I have problems with personal space.
You know,
but
what you give your kids, you know, what you think people will eat, what you think your dinner guests would like. I mean, that's the story of kale, and that's the story
I
that
think that's
we're
the
telling.
greatest way to end, and you're exactly right.
Well, let's end on that.
Thank you. Thank you.